When Spanish General Francisco de Valdez and his troops laid eyes on the Dutch city of Leiden in the morning mists of the 30th of October 1573, they were met with an eerie sight. The city appeared to have sprouted wings. Its windmills, which had been dismantled in the surrounding countryside, had been reassembled within the city walls, preparing for a long resistance. This marked the beginning of a truly staggering siege, characterized by starvation, mutiny, and a daring act of environmental warfare, the flooding of an entire region. Leiden, along with many other towns, had risen in rebellion against the foreign rule of the Spanish crown during what became known as the Dutch Revolt. In 1573, the Spanish dispatched General Francisco de Valdez to take the city and crush the uprising. Leiden now faced a severe test of endurance. Not only was the city's fate at stake, but also the broader struggle for Dutch independence. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Leiden. The Spanish governor of the Netherlands, Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, sought to end the Dutch Revolt through a campaign of terror and ruthless repression. In 1572, he dispatched his son, Don Fadrique, to the northern provinces to stamp out the uprising before it could spread. Don Fadrique showed no mercy. He sacked Mechelen and Zutphen and carried out the brutal massacre of the people of Naarden to set a grim example. But instead of breaking the rebels' spirits, these atrocities only hardened their resolve. Each drop of blood shed by the Spanish forces was fuel to the rebellion's fire. As the resistance intensified, Don Fadrique's campaign ground to a halt at Haarlem. The conquest of this rebellious city cost him almost 7 months and showed the Dutch that the Spanish army, while formidable, was not invincible. Nevertheless, Don Fadrique succeeded in capturing Haarlem, a strategically vital stronghold. Its central location effectively split the province of Holland in two, allowing the Spanish to target the northern and southern regions separately. The Duke of Alba planned to subdue the north first, with a coordinated assault by land and sea. He ordered Don Fadrique to advance on the city of Alkmaar, while simultaneously commissioning a fleet to drive the rebel forces from the Zuiderzee. The siege of Alkmaar began on the 21st of August 1573, and Don Fadrique faced difficulties from the outset. The small town sat in a low-lying area reclaimed by dikes. The arrival of artillery was delayed, and his troops, who went unpaid for nearly 2 years, were constantly on the brink of mutiny. When the first assault on the 22nd of August failed, the siege settled into a prolonged stalemate. It was not until almost a month later, on the 18th of September, that Don Fadrique ordered a second major assault. However, his soldiers, who were still lamenting the costly victory at Haarlem, refused to try to storm the city again. This hesitation gave the defenders a chance to drastically improve their situation. They breached several dikes and flooded the surrounding flatlands in a desperate yet effective act of defense. It was a bold measure, but modest compared to the inundation project they would later implement at Leiden. As the water rose, Don Fadrique found himself quite literally in deep waters and was forced to retreat on the 8th of October. Alkmaar had withstood the might of the Spanish army. To this day, the Dutch celebrate the city's resistance as a turning point in their fight for independence. Nearly 2 centuries later, an anonymous writer captured this spirit in the phrase, "Bij Alkmaar begint de victory." Victory begins at Alkmaar. However, at the time of the siege, nearly 80 more years of fighting lay ahead. While Don Fadrique besieged Alkmaar, the Count of Bossu engaged a rebel fleet on the Zuiderzee. Setting sail from Amsterdam with 18 ships, he launched an attack on the 14th of September. In response, the rebels assembled their own fleet and confronted Bossu south of Hoorn on the 11th of October. The Loyalist fleet, with its larger ships and superior firepower, attempted to maintain distance and rely on its cannons. The rebels, however, used favorable winds to close in quickly and board the enemy vessels. This tactic proved extremely effective. Within a short time, 3 rebel ships had latched onto Bossu's flagship, the Inquisitie. The entangled vessels ran aground near Denec, and a siege at sea followed. The fight surged back and forth for an entire day, until Bossu, unable to break free, was finally forced to surrender. The Battle of the Zuiderzee had far-reaching consequences. The rebels emerged with uncontested control over the bay, the islands of Den Helder, Texel, and Vlieland, and the passages between them. This effectively crippled Spanish supply lines to Amsterdam. Combined with the failure at Alkmaar, the defeat on the Zuiderzee brought the Spanish offensive in North Holland to a complete standstill, and dealt a devastating blow to the reputations of both the Duke of Alba and Don Federico. Disillusionment spread among royalist supporters in Amsterdam, where Alba came to be seen as the root of the ruin of His Royal Majesty's lands. Nevertheless, Alba had one remaining hope to redeem himself. He had to crush the rebellion in South Holland. He entrusted this task to the seasoned General Francisco de Valdez. After capturing The Hague, but failing to take Delft, Valdez turned his attention to one of the rebellion's key strongholds in South Holland, the city of Leiden. The Spanish army reached Leiden on the 30th of October 1573. As one of Holland's most vital economic and strategic centers, the city was a prized target. Its medieval fortifications were outdated, featuring semicircular towers and a surrounding moat. For once, however, the defenders had enough time to prepare. As early as November 1572, they had begun demolishing everything within a half-hour's walk of the town to create clear sidelines of the horizon. Homes, orchards, and even fortifications were reduced to rubble, leaving only the windmills standing, their blades turning at full speed to fill the city's storerooms. At the last minute, just before the Spanish army arrived, the citizens carefully dismantled the mills and set them up in open spaces within the city walls, creating the surreal first sight Valdez spotted through the mists. To bolster their defenses, Leiden's inhabitants also constructed an advanced defensive line consisting of 4 strategically placed forts around the city. Confident in their preparations, the city council believed that the 800 hired men of the Walloon mercenary garrison, who were reinforced by a formidable local militia and many of the Dutch privateers, known as sea beggars, could hold off the Spanish assault. Valdez's resources were meager in comparison. The Spanish troops had not been paid for months and repeatedly refused to undertake the labor-intensive work required for a proper siege. They were especially unwilling to risk their lives in a direct assault. Moreover, Valdez lacked proper siege artillery. Unable to dig, storm, or bombard the city, his only option was to starve the defenders into submission. And here's where things took a sharp turn. Leiden wasn't just a city with walls. It was a city that learned. It anticipated, adapted, and prepared. While others buckled under pressure, Leiden played the long game and survived. And honestly, that mindset still matters today. We might not be facing a siege with pikes and gunpowder, but let's be real, for a lot of people, job insecurity, layoffs, and the relentless pace of change can feel just as suffocating, especially with AI reshaping entire industries overnight. Even channels like this one, built on history, aren't immune to the pressure, which is something the Great War Channel aptly pointed out in a recent video. That's why I want to tell you about Triple10, today's video sponsor and a platform that helps people transition into the tech industry and do exactly what Leiden did, adapt before the crisis hits. It's beginner-friendly, fully remote, and designed to fit around your life, even if you're working full-time or switching careers mid-siege, so to speak. According to their outcomes report, 82% of their grads get hired within 6 months and earn about 70k a year on average. And what if you don't find a job? Here's the kicker: even if it takes more than 10 months after completing your program to get the job you trained for, they will refund you 100% of your tuition. Triple 10 offers unlimited externships even after graduation, so you'll keep gaining experience, just like the people of Leiden adapted to survive. If you're thinking about your next move, we highly suggest you look into Triple 10. With a 4.7 Trustpilot rating, it's clear they are worth considering. It's never too late. Start learning a new job from $200 per month. History teaches us that those who adapt win. Your career should too. The Spaniards quickly occupied the surrounding area, gradually capturing several forts and turning villages into strongholds. Within weeks, they had constructed an almost impenetrable ring around Leiden. Only to the south, toward Gouda and Delft, were a few daring messengers able to slip through the Spanish lines. However, it soon became evident just how thoroughly Leiden had prepared. The city's granaries were full to the brim, providing ample grain for the mills, and enough to bake fresh bread continuously. Moreover, the farmers who had fled into the city had brought their livestock with them. Because the Spanish had no proper siege guns to threaten them at long distance, the animals were able to peacefully graze outside the gates during the day. By spring, the townspeople even began planting gardens around the city walls, ensuring a fresh supply of vegetables in case the siege stretched into summer. Nevertheless, all knew that Leiden's supplies could not last forever. To relieve the city, William of Orange ordered his brothers, Louis and Henry, to lead an army of around 7,000 men into Holland in mid-March. They hoped to divert the Spanish by launching an attack on Maastricht. Although the assault failed and the army was forced to move north along the Meuse instead, the plan ultimately succeeded. Fearing the rebels might cut off their supply lines to Leiden, the Spanish lifted their siege and dispatched Sancho de Villa with 600 cavalry and nearly 5,000 infantry to intercept Louis and Henry. On the morning of the 14th of April 1574, the two armies clashed on the Moker Heide. De Villa's cavalry launched a series of rapid assaults, catching Louis and Henry's troops off guard. Despite a valiant defense, the Dutch rebels were overwhelmed and suffered devastating losses. Both of William's brothers were killed, along with nearly half of their army, compared to the less than 100 Spanish casualties. This crushing defeat left the rebellious provinces momentarily exposed and vulnerable. However, the Spanish were unable to capitalize on their victory. Soon after the battle, the unpaid troops finally mutinied and marched to Antwerp, which they seized in frustration over empty promises. The Spanish failure gave the rebels just enough time to raise a new army. By the end of May, when the Spaniards finally convinced their mutinous troops to leave Antwerp by paying them 1,000,000 guilders to resume service, William of Orange had already mustered 10,000 men under his command. He confidently wrote to his last surviving brother, John, quote, "It would cost the Spaniards half of Spain, both in men and resources, before they could put an end to us." William had every reason to be optimistic. Though his forces had suffered a defeat on land, they had achieved another decisive victory at sea. On the 29th of January 1574, rebel forces had defeated a loyalist fleet on the Scheldt near Reimer's Wall, prompting the Spanish garrison at Middelburg to surrender. With that, the rebels gained control over most of the waterways in the northern Netherlands. William quickly capitalized on this strategic advantage by blocking Spanish access to Antwerp from the sea at Walcheren. This dealt yet another blow to the already depleted Spanish war chest. From then on, ships could only reach the vital Spanish-controlled trading hubs of Antwerp and Amsterdam with William's permission, and only after paying steep tolls. However, Leiden's struggle was not over yet. A few months earlier, King Philip II of Spain had decided that the Duke of Alba was the wrong man to restore order in the Netherlands. His harsh, reckless policies had achieved little, and in November of 1573, the king relieved him of his office. His successor, Don Louis de Requesens y Zuniga, was tasked with ending the terror and repression, but also with intensifying military pressure on the rebels. One of his first acts was to send Francisco de Valdez back to Leiden to finish what he had started. The siege of Leiden entered its second round. on the 25th of May 1574, Valdez returned to Leiden with a force of around 10,000 men. Advancing from all directions, his troops quickly reoccupied their formerly abandoned fortifications and sealed off every waterway leading into the city. This time, Leiden's approximately 14,000 inhabitants stood alone. During the pause in the siege, the city council had dismissed its hired garrison, as tensions between the townspeople and the unruly Walloon mercenaries had repeatedly escalated. Now, defense fell to the town militia, which was still supported by civilian volunteers and sea beggar allies. Initially, the defenders attempted to disrupt the Spanish siege works by launching swift raids. Small boats would dart close to the enemy and strike suddenly to scatter laborers or blow up newly erected fortifications. These tactics managed to delay the construction, but ultimately failed to prevent it. By early June, the blockade was fully watertight. Valdez then began to increase pressure, targeting the city's food supply. After studying the defenders' grazing practices all winter, one foggy morning, he seized the opportunity to send a small unit to the city walls. There, they captured the cattle grazing outside before the townspeople even realized what was happening. By the time the alarm was raised, the Spanish were already leading the animals away. Just days later, Valdez launched an assault on the Peulburg, one of the defenders' last remaining outposts. The fort was so close to the city that the Spanish musketeers could target Leiden's gardens from its ramparts. When the Peulburg fell, the city lost yet another critical source of food. Unsurprisingly, few townspeople were willing to risk their own head for a head of cabbage. The third Spanish advance came from the opposite side of the city, where the attackers constructed a new fortification known as the Boshuiserschans. Positioned even closer to the city, it allowed the Spaniards to keep the defenders under constant watch, making any movement on the walls perilous. This proximity forced the defenders to act. On the 29th of July, militiamen and privateers launched a bold assault across the flat meadows toward the Boshuiserschans, supported by covering fire from a galley on the Old Rhine. Sending the largely inexperienced militia into open combat against the veteran Spanish troops was a grave risk, but the citizens of Leiden fought with determination. To offset their advantage, they had fashioned crude hand grenades from bottles, an improvised weapon that now proved surprisingly effective. The defenders inflicted significant losses on the Spanish forces within the redoubt, and even managed to capture 2 officers before retreating. Despite this success, the people of Leiden refrained from further sorties. Spanish eyewitness Bernardino de Mendoza observed that, quote, "It seemed as if the city was not inhabited, because no one left it or showed themselves on the walls." The defenders' initial confidence had begun to fade. Although they had done their best to stock up on provisions when the siege first had been lifted, the harvest had been weeks away when the Spaniards returned, and they had laid waste to the surrounding countryside. The Dutch had only managed to fill Leiden's storerooms halfway, and these were being depleted at an alarming rate. The sea beggars managed to smuggle in supplies occasionally, but these deliveries were little more than a drop in the ocean. Although Valdez struggled with his troops' low morale and widespread desertions, he continued to tighten the noose around Leiden. Soon, the city was completely cut off, with carrier pigeons their only link to the outside world. At the end of June, one feathered messenger returned with a letter from William of Orange. He urged Leiden's citizens to hold on and promised to come to their aid as soon as possible, though no one could say whether he would arrive in time. By late June, unrest began to spread within the city walls. The hardships of the blockade, hunger, illness, and despair were taking a toll on the population. Tensions rose as the starving and sick grew increasingly desperate. To maintain control, the city council employed a carrot and stick policy. They distributed free bread to the poor, while simultaneously erecting a gallows in front of the town hall as a grim warning to potential agitators and traitors. Meanwhile, the city guard began confiscating all privately held grain to bolster the dwindling storehouses. In mid-July, the situation worsened dramatically. The plague broke out in the city. Suddenly, scarcity, exhaustion, and hunger seemed almost trivial by comparison. The disease spread like wildfire through the crowded, weakened population, claiming hundreds of lives. This new catastrophe sent a wave of fear through the city council. Dissenters began urging surrender to the Spaniards in the hope of mercy and relief. The more steadfast supporters of the rebellion struggled to convince their fellow councillors to hold the line. The situation continued to deteriorate over the summer. By August, bread had become so scarce that the town council was forced to distribute malt cakes as rations. Though these filled the stomach, they offered far less nutritionment. Now, even the middle class could no longer afford adequate food and began to go hungry. The issue wasn't a complete lack of supplies. Rather, the wealthy were hoarding what remained. When the population realized this, it sparked open revolt. Leading the unrest were the sea beggars, furious that the townspeople were not sharing provisions with them, despite their willingness to risk their lives for the city's defense. In response, the council conducted another sweep of private storerooms, allowing each household to keep no more than a 2-week supply. However, the confiscated grain lasted only a few days. By early September, the city was forced to begin slaughtering its remaining livestock. Each family received 1 kilogram of meat every 4 days. For a family of 4, this was less than 65 grams per person per day. Leiden was on the rocks. When Valdez invited Leiden to surrender on the 5th of September, a heated debate erupted in the city council. By then, many had lost faith that William of Orange would arrive in time, and those in favor of capitulation now formed the majority. Nevertheless, the hardliners refused to yield. Ultimately, it was the memory of Naarden and Haarlem, where the Spaniards had carried out brutal massacres following the surrender, that swayed the decision. The people of Leiden were determined not to share the same fate. They would fight to the bitter end. William of Orange knew that time was running out. If Leiden fell, the entire Dutch Revolt would be in serious jeopardy. Desperate to save the city, he explored every possible solution. Options were limited. The disastrous Battle of Mokerheide had demonstrated that a traditional feet battle against the Spanish was futile. He could not count on the help of his French Protestant allies, the Huguenots, as it would take too long for their forces to reach Leiden. There was only one course of action left. Although the Dutch had only used it twice before, and on a much smaller scale, William was convinced it was their only hope. He planned to flood the region and drive the Spaniards from their positions like rats from their holes. The plan was perilous. A large portion of Holland lay below sea level, kept dry by a complex system of dikes. It was far from certain whether it would be possible to drain the flooded area again once it had been submerged. Unlike the small-scale flooding at Alkmaar, this plan would inundate a vast portion of South Holland. Furthermore, it was unclear whether the floodwaters would even reach Leiden. The terrain was so flat that a stiff northerly wind could prevent the water from spreading as needed. In the worst-case scenario, half a province could be sacrificed to only maybe rescue a single city. Despite these risks, William succeeded in convincing the states of Holland to approve his plan. In early August, he began evacuating the rural population. The area to be flooded was so vast that it would take weeks to submerge it piece by piece. Pioneers were tasked with gradually clearing a path for the water. They began by breaching the unguarded dikes along the Maas and Hollandse IJssel rivers, allowing water to flow slowly into the Delftland and Schieland districts. That, however, was the easy part. On the 10th of September, the water level had risen high enough. Admiral Lieutenant Louis de Boisseau immediately set out from Rotterdam with 70 galleys and 250 flat-bottomed ships. He commanded around 4,000 soldiers, 2,100 oarsmen, and a few hundred pioneers. Their task was both difficult and dangerous, as the next dikes they needed to breach were actively defended by the Spanish. First step was to channel the water into Rhineland by breaching the Landscheiding, a wide dike that marked Rhineland's borders with Delftland. The Spaniards were already anticipating this move, and fierce fighting broke out as soon as de Boisseau arrived. He quickly realized that pushing through at this point would be impossible, so he relied on the mobility of his ships instead. In a bold move, he suddenly swerved westward and broke through the Landscheiding the very next day. At another dam near the Zuidermeer, he encountered Valdez, who had dug in. The same scenario played out. The Dutch suffered a heavy initial defeat, but soon found an unguarded section of the dike and managed to break through. It seemed as William of Orange's fears had come true. The water level in Rhineland barely rose. Finally, after days of anxious waiting, the wind shifted and heavy rains began to fall. Gradually, Rhineland began to submerge. By early October, Boisseau was at last able to advance further. The rising floods and the pressure from the Dutch fleet forced Valdez to retreat step by step, until on the 3rd of October he had to abandon the Lammerenschans, opening the way to Leiden. The next day, the relief fleet finally reached Leiden. The Spaniards were trapped in their fortresses, like survivors clinging to life rafts, helpless as Boisseau's ships delivered reinforcements and supplies to the city. The starving people rushed eagerly to the food that had arrived. Each person received half a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, and a pickled herring. Hunger was vanquished, Leiden was saved, and the Dutch struggle for independence continued. The costs of this victory had been immense. Estimates suggest that between a third and a half of Leiden's population had perished from hunger and plague as they waited William's arrival. Once the siege was lifted, it took nearly 6 years for the flooded land to be drained. However, in exchange for their extraordinary bravery, the people of Leiden were granted the privilege of founding a university, the first in the rising Dutch Republic. After the fiasco at Leiden, Spanish governor Requesens abandoned any hope of conquering the rebellious towns by traditional means. Instead, he hoped to defeat them using their own tactics, by flooding the entirety of Holland. However, this drastic measure was too extreme for Philip II, who was unwilling to risk permanently destroying so much fertile land. Instead, he ordered an alternative but equally ruthless strategy. Requesens was to burn every unfortified settlement, every hamlet, and every farm, and execute every Dutch rebel he could capture. If rural Holland could no longer produce food, the towns would inevitably starve. Soon, the Spaniards were marauding through the countryside, looting and killing with abandon. The terror had begun anew.